Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the monthly economic briefing presented by the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I'm External Affairs Assistant Director Rob Knapp, and it's great to have you with us this morning. Let me also welcome some invited guests this morning from our MBA program, both in Chapel Hill and the Executive MBA program in Charlotte. We appreciate you all being here with us this morning, and we hope to take some questions from you a little later on in the show. So for those of you who've been with us for a while, we started the briefing in May of 2022, and this one may be a first for us. We may be looking at an interest rate cut. Haven't seen one of those yet in our time. We are going to have Christian Lundblad on from Kenan-Flagler in just a moment to talk about that. He's also going to address the jobs report this morning and some other things that I think you'll find interesting. Before we get to him, we'll go through the run of show real quickly for everybody. We'll start with Professor Lundblad's presentation. He'll speak for 15 to 20 minutes. Then we're going to take questions from you. You can submit those questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you are a member of the press, please let us know your affiliation and your title so that we can prioritize those. Also, for those of you from the MBA programs that are asking questions, which we hope you will, please let us know which program you're in. We'll get to press questions first, a couple others, and then we'll move on to the MBA questions, I would figure about 9:30, and we will go there. We have our calendars cleared out for a little while, so we'll answer as many as we can from you. If you are joining us by phone today, you can ask questions as well. You can email those to me at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. Again, we usually finish up about 9:30. We'll probably go a little bit longer today. We're looking forward to answering some questions. So that's the warm-up. Let me go ahead and introduce a gentleman who is a Kenan Institute Research Fellow. He's also the Richard Dick Levin Distinguished Professor of Finance at UNC Kenan-Flagler and Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Research. Professor Christian Lundblad. Christian, good morning. Glad to have you with us.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate the intro. So let me talk a bit about where we are. So we got a much anticipated report this morning. People have been waiting for this one with bated breath for no reason other than the fact that this is maybe the last of two pretty critical reports that are going to precede the Fed's next rate meeting. That's going to be in the middle of September. We'll get the CPI report next week. This is the employment report today. And the Fed has very, very clearly signaled that a rate cut is coming. And so the question that everybody is trying to answer, or maybe, the situation that we're trying to fully ascertain, is the extent to which there is, enough emerging weakness perhaps in the market to suggest that they would be more aggressive. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. At a minimum, this is really important data. So you can see, what did we get? We got a change in non-farm payrolls that was a bit below expectations. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Some downside on the manufacturing side in particular there. But things which were actually, a bit flatter and less dramatic elsewhere. The unemployment rate, 4.2% in line with expectations. A little bit better than the previous month, but there's some let's call them denominator effects as to sort of how many laborers are out there fully being counted. But I would view these as reasonably flat. Average weekly hours, kind of in line with expectations, in fact, slightly up from where they had been. And a modest tick up actually in wages, which suggests maybe a little bit of bargaining power out there in the marketplace. But, putting these together, there's a story. I want to walk you through it. But nothing is like dire, but there's definitely things that we ought to be seriously contemplating about the trajectory of the American economy going forward. So let's first look at the kind of the headline number, as it were, non-farm employment. So job growth unambiguously continues to moderate over here. And August, as I said, came in a bit less than expected. There was certainly some weakness on the manufacturing side. There we actually saw some reductions. Growth, to get us to the full top line number of 140 something, came in education and health, leisure, hospitality, and interestingly, construction. So there still seems to be a bit over there. I'm not entirely sure what's being built going forward, but there was some job acceleration there. And so that collectively is kind of how you get to this number. What's interesting actually is there were some downward revisions from the previous months, right? So if you kind of put all that together, the shortfall in kind of what came in relative to expectations, coupled with some of the downward revisions on the previous month's releases, this is definitely suggesting a slowing job market. I want to be super clear about this. The orange line here is kind of the 3-month collective trend. This is, clearly a different situation than we were, say, a couple of years ago. But on the other hand, we're not in a recession. That's not where we are. I want to be very, very clear. And there's nothing which is dire, but this does suggest a different trajectory and a different sort of forward-looking roadmap, and hence a different Federal Reserve policy than where we've been. What else can we say over here? Well, let's look at the unemployment rate. Again, that moderated slightly, but I would say largely was flat. And when you couple that with, the hours worked and the labor participation rate being reasonably flat, I would say that this is a weak-ish report, but not anything that is suggesting a dire situation. And if you sort of look at how markets are responding this morning, the equity market is, reasonably quiet, I would say. The bond market has increased modestly, meaning yields have fallen slightly, suggesting that market participants are kind of reading this as in the line of what I said, a little bit more of an affirmation that Fed rate cuts are on the horizon. But there's nothing dire. We're not looking at where we were a month ago when the mist that we saw there engendered all of this, substantial financial market response with blowouts and volatility and, the unwinding of carry trades and all the crazy stuff we saw back then. That's not what we're seeing, this morning by any stretch. So the kind of moves we're seeing in the bond market are directionally suggestive, but magnitude-wise kind of in line with sort of what you would expect on any sort of given day like this. I do want to make a slight detour, a digression, actually, which is, I'm going to come back to this at the very end. So I'm just going to make a point now, and I'm going to come back to a larger meta point at the end this morning, right? So separate from this particular print, I do want us to understand that since our last meeting in terms of a Fed an employment release and our last briefing, there has been a sizable collective negative job revision that has come because these data are later kind of cross-referenced and cross-triangulated in a way with other data that come in this case at lower frequency. So we get to see this in the first Friday at the end of every month. It's much of it is kind of survey-based, and then that is cross-referenced with data that are perhaps better, but less frequent. And so in doing so, we sort of reconcile these data. And what we learned from that, and that's what's this picture here, which I grabbed from the New York Times, is essentially showing collectively the U.S. economy over the last year from March. So going March the last year, collectively generated significantly fewer jobs than had been reported, 800 plus thousand. Like, this is an important release. It too is not unprecedented in magnitude. So it's not that this was some crazy magnitude. We do see this, from time to time as these reconciliations are done, but it nevertheless is suggestive of the fact that, one, just a reminder, the data are imprecise always, but two, it is again a reaffirmation of the direction of travel right now. The labor market is softening. I think we can say that clearly. I want to come back to this, however, at the very conclusion, because there is a larger point that I want to make here that I think almost deserves attention, maybe in election year. Let's put it like that, okay? So what else do I want to say here? Well, we also saw some wage growth, interestingly. So a modest tick up in wage acceleration, which is interesting as we've seen overall inflationary pressures moderate. So this suggests possibly, again, a little bit of bargaining power remaining. I'm not going to overread it too much, but it is not suggesting anything, again, dire here. Other pieces of this report are sort of flattish to slightly quiet. And so I just want to put this in context from that perspective. This has been a number we've been spending a lot of time looking at over the last couple of years because we wanted to deeply understand the interplay between wage acceleration and price acceleration. And in this case, I think we're seeing things that are, not suggestive of that becoming, continuing to be problematic. But it is it's nothing that is suggesting on the flip side that we're moving into a recession. Quite the contrary. And then finally, let's talk about something we didn't learn in this particular report, and that's on the inflationary dynamics. And so here is core PCE. So we're looking at inflation associated with consumption, the basket of goods in the consumption expenditure basket, looking at kind of over 3 months or 6 months annualized year on year. And again, we can kind of continue to see this moderation. Next week, we're going to get an update on another version of this, the CPI print, which will be really important. I think this is the second to last data item we got this morning. That's going to be kind of the last big data item. Those two will be important pieces of information that will enter into the Fed's decision-making process. Just a reminder here that we've made a lot of progress here. I mean, we really have. And inflation has come down significantly, no matter how you measure it. And so that's great news because that's what the Fed has been trying to work on. We do see some sort of potential for plateauing and somewhere. And so despite the considerable progress, I do want to remind that part of this dialogue, part of this challenge, the policy debate, really is about the potential weakness in the labor market against the intractability or the difficulty of getting fully down to the Fed's target, which would be 2%, that last mile from kind of where we are to where they would like us to be. Some argue that's going to prove harder than others, and I personally view myself in that camp. But that is the Fed's tension always, is that kind of dual mandate they face in terms of dealing with inflationary pressures against attending to the challenges of the labor market, which unambiguously deserves attention right now. I think that's a key takeaway. So let me tell you what else is not happening, right? This is where we have been in terms of financial market volatility. And the very blip you see at the end there of this sample was the sizable increase in equity market volatility that we observed at the last data release. There was a lot of consternation, a lot of unwinding that was actually taking place. We had blow-ups in different spaces, significant moves along a multitude of dimensions as the market was trying to digest what the heck was going on, and then all of these spillover and add-on effects and externalities and things that happen in financial markets when you start to unwind. And on an intraday basis, this volatility actually went up even considerably more than this, like approaching some of the levels we would have seen, in COVID or even in the financial crisis. That's not where we are right now. I want to be super clear. So that seems to be in the rearview mirror. The market has kind of settled down and is now kind of waiting to see what's going to happen in September and in the subsequent meetings going forward. But we're not observing this. So again, things have largely settled. But I would say there is still some latent instability, which is like, how all of this is going to transpire is going to have important implications for market participants and others, because we're at an inflection point, and the inflection points are the trickiest. Getting the timing right, getting the magnitudes right, and the big next question is September, a little bit later this month, and so that's really where we are waiting to see what the Federal Reserve is going to do. And so I'm going to talk about that for a moment, but in setting that up, again, a report like this, which unambiguously has components of it which are weaker, again, not dire, but weaker. I want to remind that we're not in a recession right now. That doesn't mean that a modest one, I hope, if it were to come to pass, isn't looming in the second half of this year or the beginning of the next. But we're not in a recession right now. And so maybe one way to kind of discern that is to look at sort of where people are expecting GDP growth to be for this quarter in which we are currently residing, the third quarter of 2024. A couple of different ways in which we can assess that. So the blue is based on economist forecasting. So you can kind of see the blue and then some range around that. This is as time is passing. So going from, June up until yesterday, when I grabbed this picture, this is as, economists are sort of forecasting based on what we're seeing, what do we think is going to happen for this particular quarter in which we're residing? And an alternative representation of that is the Atlanta Fed's estimation of nowcasting. Again, not forecasting, but nowcasting. We're in the quarter. What's happening right now? And you can see that bounces around a little bit as time is evolving because we're getting data items like the item that we get today that allows them to update their nowcast to figure out where we are. And again, in neither of these cases, what's coming from the economics community or what's coming from a data-driven econometric or statistical exercise to try to assess where we are, none of that is suggesting that we're in a recession right now in this quarter. And again, that doesn't mean that the recession isn't looming, but it is not at where we are at present. And so I want to put it in that context as we fathom perhaps where the Federal Reserve is headed for the next meeting and in the meetings hence. So again, what did we get? Also, since our last meeting, we got a very clear speech from the Fed chair suggesting the time has come to significantly turn our attention to the labor market. And the expectation that came along with that clearly from market participants is a Federal Reserve rate decline. That's it, clearly. That was as strong a statement as you get out of a Fed chair. We got one. And so now let's look at what the market is suggesting may be the roadmap for Federal Reserve policy. So I want to show you a couple of these, and then I want to come back and kind of make a higher altitude point that I've hinted at already, and then I'm happy to take your questions. So here is a signal. It's the federal funds futures market. This is a market that is trading in Chicago that is allowing us to discern what market participants are thinking the Fed is likely to do in the meetings hence, right? So here's the Fed funds futures contracts for September's meeting. And right now, again, we're sitting at 5.25, 5.25 to 5.5% is where the current policy rate resides. And then here are essentially probabilities that we can backward engineer or reverse engineer out of the prices for which this contract is trading. And so the market is sort of sitting at a slightly higher probability for a one-notch cut, a 25 basis point cut. That's what you see on the right of your screen. But there is some probability based on that pricing, which is suggesting a 50 basis point cut. That is exactly where we are. The market is sort of struggling to figure out, will the Fed do its kind of normal movement, or are we anticipating something more aggressive from them? Right now, I was kind of looking at how a sister version of this contract was pricing this morning just as I jumped on. And again, the weakness has sort of brought this a little closer to a coin flip this morning. And again, that's suggesting the market is kind of trying to struggle with this. My personal view is that the Fed is going to cut, and they're going to cut by 25 basis points. But we'll learn a little bit more when we get the CPI report next week. And I think the Fed would be only likely to move in a more aggressive fashion if things were more dire than we saw this morning. But again, there are lots of folks out there who have a very different opinion that the Fed ought to be moving more aggressively, that the inflationary concerns and the last mile problem that I've articulated are overblown. I don't share that view, but that's theirs. And that the labor market weakness is only the beginning of a more significant concern, and the Fed is behind the curve. That's a view out there. My view is the Fed will and ought to be quite moderate and read the tea leaves as they transpire. But I want you to see, like, that's why this kind of coin flip is out there in a way. What I can tell you is this market, as we start looking out further, so this is where the market is trading for the summer of next year. And so if you look at kind of the direction of travel, and if you sort of see where the mass of this distribution is, or kind of where the market is kind of telling us the Fed is likely to be moving, you can see, just look at the x-axis of this, some really significant declines are expected. So, well over, 100 plus basis point declines, that the Fed is anticipated to deliver, as we get into the summer of next year. So again, what exactly is going to happen in September is a bit of a debate. But the market is clearly signaling some very, very significant work that the Fed is going to be doing, into the middle part of the next year. And that's, again, reflecting an expectation that inflationary pressures are largely, or at least will be, off the table, and the necessity will be to attend to the labor market from that point forward. Okay? So, last thing I want to mention, and I'm happy to take questions on any of this. Let's come back to this for a moment. I think this is worth mentioning, right? And so I want to give you two sides of a coin here. One, I want to remind these data, this morning's data, any data that we get from government statistical agencies or elsewhere, they are imprecise. They are based on survey methodologies or other methodologies that necessarily require trade-offs. Revisions are not uncommon, as we saw this morning as well. And so there's nothing odd or nefarious or problematic about any of that, not in the slightest. Secondly, there is nothing problematic with having a data revision of this magnitude, because it came because we got other data which allowed us to cross-reference or triangulate with cleaner and better data that just simply comes at a lower frequency. Again, nothing problematic there at all. However, and this is important, there have been some issues associated with data releases that have gotten some attention. As a matter of fact, this particular data release right here was associated with a release timing that turned out to be a bit problematic, and generated a bit of concern and possibly some disproportionate access to that data. Again, not necessarily anything nefarious. I view that as simply a problem that needs attending to. Here is the biggest issue in my opinion, and I almost raised this on a day like this, the labor report that gets so much attention for good reason, in advance of a major election, in advance of a time where we are struggling to make sure that we have the data that we need to be informed, right? I mean, you go back to an earlier time, like the Great Depression or something like that, and we built many of the data machinery that we enjoy today because of the lessons learned in that time. We did not have the data that we needed in those moments to make informed and timely policy decisions. I mean, at times, like, it's reported that, Hoover back then was looking at data that was like a year old in order to try to make policy decisions, in the moment, or at least his Treasury department was. That we've learned from that. We've made progress. And for all of the really cool stuff that's happened with regards to, to data creation and acquisition and processing and machine learning and AI and all that's coming, one of the really, really critical components is fully resourcing the data organizations that sit inside federal and state governments. And those resources are constrained right now. And so this is not a minor point. Like, actually, it is important that we make the investments as a country that are required to continue to have the quality of data that we need going forward. And I fear that those budgets have been constrained to the points where then this is getting more challenging. And so as we think about the importance of a moment like today, and as we think about what it is we ought to prioritize, perhaps data are not as sexy as, some other things that we might value, wherever you sit on the political spectrum. But I want to put that back on the radar screen, because that does matter. And it allows organizations like the Fed and others to make credible and intelligent and informed policy choices. And so while I have you and I get to make the point, this particular data release that you see right here, in and of itself is not problematic, but it actually was an example of a release that became problematic. And I think it's representative of a larger point, that is the data that we invest in to unearth and process. They're really important in the work that we do as policymakers, economists, financial market participants, managers, and the like. So I'll leave it there, Rob, with my my soapbox now removed. And thank yeah.
Off the soapbox for now, but thanks. That's a lot of information packed into 20 minutes on a lot of different subjects. And I would argue, I would think, given our audience, that there are some people out here that do think data is sexy. So maybe we'll let the MBAs weigh in on that. But you're talking to the right folks. Let me remind folks, you can submit your questions to be answered. Just use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen on your Zoom screen. Let us know if you are with the press. Let us know if you are one of our MBA or prospective MBA invitees so that we can prioritize, and we'll try to get those questions answered. Christian, first one is from Lauren Osorge at the Triangle Business Journal. What is the takeaway for Triangle CEOs and founders when it comes to the interest rate environment?
Yeah, so I get, this is complex because the interest rate environment is changing, not in isolation. So if you sort of took a true isolated view, the interest rate environment is clearly moderating. It's coming down. Whom does that benefit? Obviously, that benefits, firms that reside in the Triangle, in the sense that, their cost of capital come down, their ability to access capital to do compelling things, that's going to moderate. To the extent that a subset of those organizations are selling product to customers that purchase on credit, that's a more pleasurable environment for them too, and so that makes it a little bit easier. So obviously those who are in the business of real estate and the like. But the reason that those interest rates are coming down is because the economy is softening, the labor market is softening, and so as the business community here in the Triangle and elsewhere in the United States needs to think carefully. There are competing forces over here, but in isolation, the interest rate environment is an easier one from that perspective. Indeed, that's a little bit what the Fed is trying to induce, is some economic activity that might not otherwise take place to soften the direction of travel on a moderating economy.
Okay. Is there anybody either within that group or outside of that group that a cut in interest rates will work against?
Well, I mean, if you're in the banking community, interest rate cuts are interesting, right? I mean, how does a bank make money on the interest rate margin that they charge their depositors? That they reward their depositors versus the interest they charge on their loans. And so, as interest rates move around, and often when they fall, that makes some complicating space there, in between, essentially what describes their profit margins. And so, I would say that's a first order effect. I would say the deeper effect is the one that I alluded to earlier, which is the reason interest rates are coming down mean that certain industries in certain places are seeing a slow in demand that will be more consequential for some than others. And so, again, interest rates don't decline in isolation. They reflect a broader economic truth, right?
Right. Okay. Have a question from Barbara Stennett. She's one of our regular attendees, and she asked a couple of things about the revisions, which she spoke about. So, Barbara, I'm going to try and pull a piece out of one question that maybe gets it at a point that Christian didn't talk about as much. She says, if it were related to the vagaries of data collection, one would think the revisions would be relatively equal up or down. These have all tended to trend down. Does that tell us anything about maybe some of the corrections that need to be made to get closer on these things?
So if we take the longer history, even for the big one that I just described, so not just kind of the revisions we get on the labor report for the previous month, but like these cross reconciliations and things like that, it isn't unidirectional, to be clear. So you can get, bi-directional revisions. That happens. And that doesn't even necessarily have to be tied to a particular general direction of travel. Like today, we're getting a number that's coming a little softer than expectations, and we're getting revisions that suggest the previous months were a little weaker than we thought. Like collectively, that's all sort of telling a narrative that I do want to emphasize. Like, the labor market is weaker, but there's nothing which even says in a weakening labor market that the revision has to be lower than it was. It can actually be higher, and all sorts of things in between. So I think I would say, the revisions we got today are meaningful in my opinion, or at least they add to the story. But the general narrative is not that, anything is unidirectional. I think it is a reflection of the fact that these are preliminary estimates. They're good faith estimates, and then revisions happen on both sides. And that's always been true. My appeal is broader, which is we need to, given all those limitations, resource the data collection agencies and processors at a level that is commensurate with the importance of these data.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So you spoke of this. Our last briefing, we had a big market movement that day, which we sort of watched as we were doing the briefing. Your colleague Greg Brown pointed out that there was a big market movement. He didn't place a lot of importance on it. He didn't run for the hills. What would you hope that maybe some of the MBA students would have looked at that morning and come to the same conclusion and said this market movement does not necessarily reflect what's going on out there?
Yeah, so market movements like that are tricky. So, even this morning, actually, we had a little bit more of a sharp reaction in the bond market right upon the announcement. Nothing like what we saw last month. And then it's already moderated a bit, to be clear. I mean, I'm looking right now, and it's significantly moderated, actually, relative to when we just started our briefing. So, so from that perspective, things can happen where people are just trying to understand, and as they understand, they form an expectation, they dig a little bit deeper, and that's all the normal challenge. I think what we got last week was not just that. There was a bit more on top of that, which was what starts to happen when you have significantly sizable market movements is you start to create these feedback mechanisms and triggers. And so, for example, people talked a lot about a particular trading strategy or a funding strategy, I guess is the right way to put it, and called the carry trade. And so suddenly, as I start to not only react and unwind something, my actions create implications for others, and it forces them to act. And you get these kind of self-reinforcing mechanisms that extend beyond just to like, how are we reading the tea leaves? It almost forces action by others and creates externalities. And so those are the things that are often quite dramatic. That's what we saw both on the Friday and in the Monday next last time.
Right.
And are temporary, but dramatic and disruptive. And so it's even more than just looking at the data and spending the time it requires to try to form a proper expectation. The nature of our financial system has feedback mechanisms that, for all that the good that it does and all the important roles that financial markets play, that's part of the DNA too, I think.
Okay. This is from Tyler Brown. What steps do you think the Federal Reserve can take to allay self-reinforcing concerns of a slowdown by making a larger than previously anticipated cut in rate?
Yeah. So this is a really nuanced question, actually, Tyler, that you asked, because there's what should a central bank do given the state of the economy and where they credibly and objectively think it's going. But remember, like this, the world it's not a physics problem, right? So it's not, particles are moving with a certain law of motion, and I, adjust that with some, disruption, and then I sort of know how the particles are going to move from there. Like, these are human beings, and there's self-reinforcing mechanisms too there as a psychological component. And so, by doing something as the Fed, I don't just, shock the system and then it goes back according to its law of motion. The human beings also learn something from the Fed's action and the law of motion changes, right? There's a psychological component, and they're going to look back at the thing that shocked them and actually, change their opinion in a way. And so it becomes a very, sort of odd, reflexivity that can happen as a consequence. So again, there is a very deep and legitimate philosophical debate right now among economists about how hard the last mile is going to be on inflation. I'm worried about that, as I've said clearly, versus that being overblown and the labor market concerns are very serious and the Fed is behind the curve and they should be moving sharply. That's a legitimate debate. And so that would inform a 25 or a 50 basis point move in September, or kind of where you are on that, and then the trajectory of the Federal Reserve action going forward. However, in addition to that, if the Fed were to move by 50, that also sends a signal about what it is they're worried about and what they see, and that can become self-reinforcing. I mean, that's the complexity here. So some might say, well, the Fed ought to be moving 50, but I'm worried they ought not to, because then they almost affirm the fact that they're freaked out or something. And so I suspect, regardless of what I think they ought to do, which is go 25, I suspect they're more likely to go 25 to avoid that kind of, hey, what do they know that we don't kind of concern.
Okay. So some equal time for the data and the human aspect of the whole thing. Justin Miller with the Evening MBA program says there were concerns last month with the release of the labor data that the Fed may have waited too long to lower interest rates. Do you believe the data released today indicates that a rate drop is going to come later than it should, or at the appropriate time?
Yeah, so I think the Fed was very late to the game in raising rates in the earlier episode, and I was quite critical myself. I thought their take on how challenging inflation was going to be was wrong. But they are an inflation fighter. That's part of their job, to be clear, and so they need to manage this dual mandate, which is inflation against the labor report. And given this tension I've described now a couple times this morning between getting inflation down to where you'd like it versus where the labor market is, I think the Federal Reserve is and should be moderate about this. But I have many good friends that think that they're behind the curve in this direction, right? And so I just want to lay out that intellectual debate, which is, hey, look, professor, your view of inflationary being challenging is wrong, and the Fed ought to have already moved and should be moving faster. And so that view is out there among good well-meaning and highly informed people. And so I think that's in the rearview mirror now. So the last data release is gone. We're here now. I think what this report does is it affirms that there's some continued direction of travel as inflation continues to moderate, and that's why CPI is going to be important next week. And coupled with this report, I think we're likely to get 25 basis points, and that will, I think, be the right call. And there'll be some who are asking them to have and continue to move faster in the downward direction. That's the intellectual debate, I think, at present.
Here's another one. I don't have a name, but this is a full-time MBA student. He says, I think your point about data integrity and resourcing is really interesting. I would love to hear your perspective on how we leverage our civic duty to support continued investment in data resourcing. Thanks for this info. I'm trying to grow in this area and appreciate your time and wisdom.
Yeah, my pleasure. So, well, I think civic duty here is when we talk about the importance of what Washington does, look, this is almost like a big point, right? In a way, anyone, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, you could look at something like the Department of Defense and say there's a lot of waste there, or you could be a national security hawk and say what the Department of Defense does is incredibly important, and the reality is both are true, right? You could look in the Department of Education and say the same thing. You can look in the department of, the departments, the EPA that attend to our our environmental considerations and say the same thing. There's a lot of waste in Washington, and there are a lot of mission critical functions that I think the nature of the political discourse right now is devaluing, right? And that's that. I guess that's my point, which is there's waste, and we ought to be tough on all of Washington to make sure that the expenditures that we're doing are warranted, and no favorite of any political party should be immune from that scrutiny. But at the same time, we've got a lot of really important things that Washington does. And I'm just adding to the dialogue that part of that is also data collection. And maybe this audience is more inclined, but many out there would be like, who the hell cares about what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does? It's really important. It's really important. And all the attention that it gets this morning is hinged on that. And so civic duty, yes, fine. Complain about Washington in whatever way your political inclinations direct you. But don't forget the fact that Washington is really, really important.
Okay, very good. Let's see. I might give it a couple more minutes for questions to come in. If you have one, go ahead and submit it with the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will take it. In the meantime, Christian, if I can take a quick second and maybe remind folks of what we might have to offer them in the coming days. For those of you in the media, we'd love to continue the conversation. You can contact me to get in contact with any of our experts. I'm at rob_knapp at Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. For everybody in the audience, we hope that you will visit our website at kenaninstitute.unc.edu. This semester has just started. We have a lot of things going on. We have speakers coming. Our grand challenge about building business resilience continues. We have our conference, the Frontiers of Business Conference, coming up October 10th here in Chapel Hill. Information on all of those things can be found on our website, plus a lot more. We hope you will visit soon and often. I am not seeing any more questions. So I think perhaps we may have done our civic duty here today. Thank you very much to Christian Lundblad for his presentation and his answers to a lot of questions. Very much appreciated, Christian. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of fun.
And thank you all for attending today. We appreciate you coming. We will be back in October. We may not be with you on the day the jobs numbers come out. We will be back to you on that. So if you get our invitation via email, look for that. If not, come to our website. We will have news on it there as soon as we have a date in October for you. So we hope you check on that. We'll see you then. But in the meantime, thanks for coming today and have a great Friday.